You can't hide from me!
Morgan had spent the last 3 hours drinking himself into a version of courage that only existed when he was angry. By the time he reached Eve Hughes' apartment, the alcohol had done what it always did for men like him. It turned humiliation into blame. It turned obsession into purpose. It turned the simple fact that she had left him into something he could call betrayal. He stood outside her door with the wooden bat low in one hand, breathing through his mouth, staring at the frame as if it had insulted him personally. The building was quiet. No footsteps in the hall, no voices through the walls. The silence made him bold. It made him feel hidden. It made him believe that what happened next would belong only to him. He hit the door hard. The lock tore loose with a cracking snap. Wood burst inward. A jagged spray of splinters jumped through the cold blue light pouring in from the corridor. Eve was exactly where his memory wanted her to be. Barefoot, cornered, thin night clothes catching the moonlight, one hand already half raised before she seemed to understand she had moved it, the other pressed against the wall behind her as though she could disappear into it. Her eyes were wide, not angry, not defiant, just frightened in the old way he remembered. For one ugly second, satisfaction settled into his chest. Then the room answered him. A soft, deliberate sound, ice touching crystal. Morgan turned toward the living room. Kang Eryun sat in the armchair near the window like the night had been arranged around him. Dark suit, perfect, white shirt sharp against the shadows, one leg crossed, whiskey glass loose in his hand, his posture so relaxed it made the broken door feel childish. He did not look at the wreckage. He did not look at the bat. He looked only at Morgan. "I was starting to think," Kang said quietly, "you'd finally learn not to come where I'm waiting." Morgan's hand tightened around the bat, because he knew that face. And in the space of a single heartbeat, the entire room stopped belonging to him.
If you love stories about strength, justice, and unexpected protection, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the Korean Boss Diaries. Now, let's go back to the night Eve thought she was alone.
Morgan didn't answer right away. For a moment, he just stood there in the broken doorway, chest rising and falling, the bat hanging heavy in his hand like he had forgotten why he brought it. The alcohol that had carried him up the stairs now sat wrong in his stomach, turning slow and sour. But the anger was still there, stubborn as ever, refusing to let him feel anything else. His eyes moved past Kang Eryun, back to Eve. She hadn't moved from the wall. That was the part that steadied him. The fear on her face, the way her shoulders were tight, her hands still lifted halfway like she didn't trust herself to drop them. He knew that look. He had seen it too many times to mistake it now. It was the same expression she used to get when his voice got loud, when the apartment got too quiet, when she realized she had said the wrong thing without meaning to. For a second, the past slid into place so easily it almost made him smile.
You think you can get away with this?
You really thought you could just disappear? Morgan said, his voice rough from drink and shouting before he'd even spoken. Change your number? Move across town? Stop answering my calls like that was gonna fix anything? Eve's lips parted, but no sound came out. Morgan took a step inside, boots crunching over splinters. He didn't look at Kang this time. He didn't want to. Looking at him made the room feel wrong, like the floor had shifted under his feet. Looking at Eve made it feel the way it was supposed to. "You don't get to walk away like nothing happened," he went on, louder now, like the words themselves could push the doubt back out of his head. "You think you can just act like I don't exist after everything I did for you, after everything I put up with?" His grip tightened on the bat. "You think you get to decide when it's over?" Eve shook her head quickly, not even in disagreement, just an instinct, the way someone does when they know any answer could make things worse. "Morgan, please," she said softly, "you shouldn't be here." The words hit him harder than the door had, not because they were loud, because they were calm, like she was talking to a stranger. His jaw clenched, the muscle jumping hard under his skin. You don't tell me where I should be, he snapped. This, he gestured around the apartment with the bat, the motion sharp and careless. This was my place too. You don't just erase me from it because you feel like starting over. He took another step forward, close enough now that the fear in her eyes filled his whole view. That was better. That was familiar. That was how things were supposed to feel. You always did this, he muttered, lower now, the anger slipping into something tighter, more personal. Act like you're the victim, like I'm the bad guy for not letting you throw everything away the second it gets hard. Behind him, the faint clink of glass against the armrest sounded again. Morgan froze for half a second, then forced himself not to turn. He kept his eyes on Eve, because as long as she looked scared, he could pretend the night still belonged to him. The apartment had been quiet before the door broke. That was the part Eve kept thinking about, even with Morgan standing only a few steps away, even with the cold night air still drifting through the splintered frame. Just an hour earlier, the place had felt small in the way she liked it. Lamps on, curtains half closed, the low hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. Nothing dramatic, nothing tense, just the ordinary kind of silence she had spent months trying to believe meant she was finally safe. She had learned to love that kind of silence. At first, after she left him, it had terrified her. Every creak in the hallway, every car door outside, every voice drifting through the walls felt like a warning that he had found her again. She used to check the lock 3 times before going to bed, used to keep the lights on longer than she wanted just so the shadows wouldn't move the wrong way. But little by little, the fear had started to loosen. New routines helped, new numbers, new keys, a different building where no one knew her name and no one asked questions when she came home late. She told herself that was enough, that distance counted for something, that if she kept her head down and stayed quiet, the past would eventually get tired of chasing her. Tonight had felt like proof she was right. She had made tea she didn't really want, just to give herself something warm to hold. Sat on the edge of the couch with her feet tucked under her, listening to the soft tick of the clock on the wall. The kind of ordinary moment she used to think she would never get back. For the first time in a long while, she hadn't been thinking about Morden at all. She hadn't been thinking about the way his moods used to change without warning, or the way every conversation used to feel like stepping across thin ice. She hadn't been replaying old arguments in her head, wondering what she should have said differently, what she should have stayed quiet about, what might have kept things from turning the way they always did. She had just been sitting there, letting the quiet exist. Then the first sound came from the hallway. Not loud, just a heavy step, uneven, like someone leaning too hard against the floor. Her stomach had tightened before her mind even caught up. She told herself it was nothing. Someone coming home late, someone dropping something, someone who had nothing to do with her. The second sound was closer, a dull thud against the door. Her hand had frozen halfway to the cup on the table, fingers hovering in the air like she'd forgotten what they were for. She didn't move, didn't breathe. Didn't even blink, because her body remembered before her thoughts did. It remembered the rhythm of his anger, the way noise always came first, then the silence, then the moment when everything in the room stopped feeling safe at the same time. When the third hit landed against the door, harder this time, the old fear came back all at once, sharp and familiar and impossible to argue with. She stood up without thinking, backing toward the wall, her hands already lifting, her shoulders tightening, her eyes fixed on the handle as if staring hard enough might keep it from turning. For months, she had told herself he wouldn't come back. For months, she had believed she was finally out of reach. And in the space between one breath and the next, that belief shattered as easily as the lock. Morgan's voice filled the apartment, loud enough to make the broken door tremble where it hung off the hinge. But the sound didn't land the way he wanted it to. It scattered against the walls, thin and uneven, like the room itself had decided not to hold it anymore. Eve could hear every word, But her attention kept slipping past him, pulled toward the darker part of the living room where the lamp didn't quite reach. The shadows there had felt harmless an hour ago, just corners of a small apartment, places where the light didn't bother to stay. Now they felt crowded. Morgan kept talking, pacing a step closer, the bat dragging slightly in his hand, as if he needed the weight of it to remind himself why he was here. "You think you get to shut me out and that's it?" he said, his voice cracking between anger and something almost desperate. "You think you can just pretend none of it happened?" Eve barely heard him, because under his words, under the sound of her own breathing, something else moved in the room. Soft, controlled, the faintest click of glass touching wood. Morgan heard it too. His head turned halfway before he caught himself, jaw tightening like he was angry at the sound for existing at all. For a second, he stood there, shoulders stiff, eyes fixed on Eve, as if refusing to look anywhere else would keep the moment from changing. The sound came again, a slow shift of ice inside a glass. Not loud, not sharp, just enough to make the silence feel heavier instead of empty. Morgan turned the rest of the way. The living room looked the same as it had when he forced the door open, couch against the wall, small table by the window, curtains half drawn, moonlight spilling through in pale strips across the floor. And the armchair. He hadn't even noticed it before. Kang Eryun sat there like he had never been anywhere else. One leg crossed over the other, back straight but relaxed, the dark fabric of his suit untouched by the chaos a few feet away. The white of his shirt caught the low light from the window, sharp against the shadows, his long dark hair tied neatly at the back of his neck. In his hand, the whiskey glass rested loosely, fingers barely curled around it, as if he had all the time in the world to finish it. He didn't look at the broken door. He didn't look at the bat. He didn't even look at Eve. His eyes stayed on Morgan, steady and unreadable, the kind of calm that didn't come from confidence, but from certainty. For a moment, nobody spoke. Morgan's grip tightened on the bat, the muscles in his arm pulling hard under his skin. But the anger that had carried him into the apartment didn't move the same way now. It stalled somewhere in his chest, caught between instinct and recognition. Kang tilted the glass slightly, the ice inside giving one quiet knock against the side. "I was wondering," he said, his voice low, almost conversational, "how long it would take you to remember this was a mistake." The words didn't sound like a threat. That's what made them worse. Kang stared at him, breathing heavier now, the certainty gone from his face, replaced by something tighter, something that hadn't been there when he kicked the door in. Because he knew exactly who was sitting in that chair, and suddenly the apartment didn't feel like Eve's anymore. It didn't feel like his either. It felt like a place he should never have walked into at all. Morgan didn't answer right away. He stood there in the middle of a living room, the bat still in his hand, his eyes locked on Kang Eryun, like looking away might make the man disappear. The alcohol that had carried him up the stairs was fading fast now, leaving his head too clear, his thoughts moving in sharp, uncomfortable lines he couldn't slow down. "You don't get to sit there like that," he muttered, the words coming out rough like he had to force them past something stuck in his throat. "This doesn't have anything to do with you." Kang didn't move. He didn't even blink. "That's where you're wrong," he said quietly. The calm in his voice made the room feel smaller. Morgan swallowed, his jaw tightening as he shifted his weight, the floor creaking under his boots. He glanced toward Eve for half a second, like he needed to remind himself why he came here, but the look on her face wasn't helping anymore. The fear was still there, but it wasn't the only thing in her eyes now. There was confusion, too, and something else he didn't like seeing. Questions. "You've been busy," Kang went on as if they were discussing something ordinary. "Busy enough that I started to think you forgot who you owed." Morgan's fingers tightened around the bat. "I don't owe you anything," he snapped. Too fast, too loud. "That was done. I paid what I had to pay." Kang tilted the glass slightly, watching the ice turn before answering. You paid some of it, he said. Then you decided you were smarter than the people you borrowed from. The words landed slow, heavy. Morgan's shoulders stiffened, but he didn't speak. Eve's gaze moved between them, her breathing still uneven, her back still pressed to the wall, but the fear in her chest was changing shape. This wasn't just about Morgan anymore. Whatever this was, it had been here before he broke the door. You took something that wasn't yours, Kang continued. Something that didn't belong in your hands and definitely didn't belong in a place like this. His eyes flicked once around the apartment, not judging, not impressed, just measuring. Morgan shook his head, a sharp, angry motion that felt more like denial than argument. I don't know what you're talking about. Kang's expression didn't change. You ran, he said, changed numbers, changed jobs, moved twice. Thought if you stayed loud enough, long enough, nobody would notice you were disappearing. Morgan's breathing grew heavier now, his chest rising and falling faster, now the bat lowering a few inches without him realizing it. You should have stayed gone, Kang added softly. Silence pressed into the room after that, thick and uncomfortable. Eve could feel it in her throat, in her chest, in the way her hands had started to shake without her telling them to. She looked at Morgan again, really looked this time, and saw something she had never seen when they were together. Not anger, not control, not even the ugly satisfaction he used to get when she was afraid. This was different. This was the look of a man who came here thinking he was the worst thing in the room and was realizing he wasn't even close. Morgan's voice came out lower now, almost careful. What do you want? Kang leaned back slightly in the chair, the leather creaking under the shift, his glass resting against the armrest. What you took, he said, and the truth about where you hid it. His gaze moved past Morgan, settling briefly on Eve, and why it led me here. Morgan's head snapped toward Eve before he could stop himself. It was a small movement, quick enough that he might have thought no one noticed, but in the quiet of the apartment it felt loud. His eyes stayed on her for a second too long, and that was all it took. Kang Eryun saw it. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, just the faintest shift of expression, like a piece of a puzzle had settled exactly where he expected it to. So, Kang said softly, his voice almost thoughtful, it really is here. Morgan's grip tightened around the bat again, but the motion didn't have the same force it did before. His shoulders were stiff now, his breathing uneven, his anger fighting with something heavier that kept pulling it down. You're wrong, he said, shaking his head hard. You don't know what you're talking about. I never brought anything here. Eve looked from one of them to the other, her heart beating so fast it felt like it might shake her ribs apart. The words didn't make sense yet, but the way Morgan was standing did. The way he wouldn't look at her for more than a second. The way his voice kept changing, like he was trying to find the version of himself that knew what to do. What? What is he talking about? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Morgan didn't answer. Kang did. You ever wonder, he said, still looking at Morgan, why he kept coming back here even after you left him? Eve froze. The question slid into her chest slowly, like something cold finding its way under her ribs. Morgan let out a sharp breath. Don't start. You moved, Kang went on calmly, cutting over him without raising his voice. Different building, different job, different number. You did everything right. His eyes shifted to Eve for the first time, steady and unreadable. But he never really let this place go. Eve felt her back press harder against the wall without meaning to. The apartment suddenly felt smaller, like the air had changed, like the quiet she had trusted for months had been hiding something she never thought to look for. Morgan? She said, her voice trembling now. What did you do? He shook his head again, faster this time, the denial almost frantic. Nothing, I didn't do anything. He's just trying to scare you, that's what this is. He wants you to think... You used what you had, Kang said quietly. The one place nobody would think to search. The one place you thought was still yours, even after she told you to stay away. Morgan's jaw clenched so hard, the muscle jumped under his skin. I didn't bring anything here. Kang leaned forward slightly, resting the glass on the armrest, his gaze never leaving Morgan's face. You didn't bring it for her, he said. You brought it for yourself. The words hung in the air, heavy and certain. Eve's eyes moved slowly around the apartment, over the table, the shelf near the window, the stack of books by the couch she hadn't touched in weeks. Ordinary things, things she saw every day without thinking. Now they didn't feel ordinary at all. Her stomach tightened. You hid something here, she whispered. Morgan didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at the floor like the truth might stay buried if he didn't look up. And in the silence, Eve realized something that made her fear shift into something colder. This apartment hadn't just been the place she ran to. It had been the place he never really left.
You think you could just sit there? I'm not playing games!
Morgan let out a short, humorless laugh, the sound sharp enough to cut through the silence that had settled over the room. He rubbed his mouth with the back of his hand, like he could wipe the tension off his face, then looked up again, forcing his shoulders to square. You know what? He said, louder now. I'm done with this. He shifted his grip on the bat, lifting it slightly, not swinging, just enough to remind everyone in the room that it was still there. The movement felt rehearsed, like something he had done 100 times before when he needed the world to fall back into place. You come in here, sit in my face, start talking like you own everything, he went on, his voice rising with every word. You think you can scare me by throwing around stories? You think I'm just going to stand here and let you talk about debts and hiding things like any of that means something to me? Kang didn't move, not even when the bat came up a little higher. Morgan noticed that, and the lack of reaction irritated him more than if Kang had stood up or reached for something. The stillness made his anger feel wasted, like he was swinging at air. This doesn't have anything to do with you, Morgan snapped. This is between me and her. He jerked his chin toward Eve without looking at her. She's the one who ran. She's the one who started all this. I came here to talk. That's it. To fix what she broke. Eve felt the words hit her like something thrown from across the room. For a second, the old instinct tried to come back, the one that made her want to explain, to calm him down, to say whatever would make his voice drop again. Her fingers curled against the wall behind her, nails pressing into the paint. She didn't speak. Morgan took that silence as permission. You hear me? He said, stepping forward, his boots crunching over the broken wood near the door. You don't get to act like I'm the bad guy just because you decided you were done. That's not how this works. You don't just erase somebody like me and pretend everything's fine. He pointed the bat toward the floor, then toward the couch, then toward the apartment itself, the motion getting sharper as his control slipped. This place, this life, you think you built this by yourself? You think you don't owe me anything after everything I did for you? The room stayed quiet. Too quiet. Morgan's breathing got heavier, his chest rising and falling fast now, the anger pushing him forward, even though something in his eyes had started to look less certain. He turned back toward Kang, jaw tight. You? He said, the word coming out like a challenge. You don't scare me, sitting there with a glass like you're watching a movie. You think I don't know what this is? You think I haven't dealt with guys like you before? Kang finally moved, just enough to set the whiskey glass down on the armrest. The soft click of crystal against wood sounded louder than Morgan's shouting. Morgan's voice faltered for half a second, then came back harder, like he was trying to push past the hesitation. I'm not leaving, not until I'm done talking, not until she looks at me and tells me to my face that this is over. His eyes went back to Eve, demanding, burning, desperate to pull the moment back under his control. For a heartbeat, the room held still. Morgan stood there with the bat in his hand, breathing hard, waiting for someone to give him the fight he understood. But the silence that answered him didn't feel like fear anymore. It felt like the moment before something ended. Morgan's chest rose and fell hard, each breath louder than the last, like the air in the room had thickened and he had to fight to pull it in. No one answered him. Eve stayed against the wall, her hands lowered now but still close to her chest, her eyes moving between Morgan and Kang without knowing where it was safe to look. Kang sat exactly the way he had before, one hand resting on the arm of the chair, his posture loose, his expression unchanged. The silence stretched. Morgan couldn't stand it. He took a step forward, then another, the broken wood under his boots cracking softly. The bat came up in his hands without him thinking about it, his fingers tightening around the handle until the muscles in his forearm stood out hard under his skin. "You think I'm joking?" he said, his voice rough, almost shaking. "You think I came all the way here to stand around while you talk like you're in charge?" Kang didn't answer. That was the part that broke whatever control Morgan had left. With a sharp, angry sound in the back of his throat, he swung the bat sideways, not at Eve, not yet, but hard enough that the air whistled as it cut through it. The motion was fast, violent, familiar, the kind of movement his body knew without him having to think. "You don't tell me when I'm done," he snapped. "Nobody tells me when I'm done." He took one more step toward the chair. The distance between them closed in an instant. For a split second, it looked like the bat might actually come down. Kang moved. Not fast, not in any way that looked like panic. He just stood up. The motion was smooth, almost lazy, the glass already set aside, his jacket falling straight as he rose. One step to the side, just enough to change the angle, just enough that the swing Morgan had already committed to cut through empty space instead of bone. The bat slammed into the edge of the chair with a dull crack. Before Morgan could pull it back, something else moved in the room. A blur from the side. A hand caught his wrist, hard enough to make his fingers loosen. Another arm locked around his shoulder, twisting him off balance so fast his feet slipped on the broken wood near the door. Morgan swore, trying to jerk free, but the strength he expected to have wasn't there. The bat fell from his hand and hit the floor with a heavy thud that seemed to echo longer than it should have. By the time he realized what was happening, he was on his knees. One man behind him, another holding his arm down, the pressure precise, controlled, nothing wasted. They hadn't rushed in shouting. They hadn't kicked the door or made a sound. They had just been there, waiting. Morgan struggled once, hard, his shoulders straining, his breath coming out in a sharp grunt. But the grip on him didn't change. If anything, it tightened just enough to remind him how useless the fight was. Kang stepped forward, stopping a few feet away, looking down at him with the same calm expression he had worn all night. No anger, no excitement, just certainty. "You had 4 seconds, Kang said quietly. "That's about how long you ever had." Morgan froze, the fight draining out of him as fast as it had come. For the first time since he broke the door, his eyes lost that wild edge and settled into something else. Not rage, not control, something closer to understanding. Because he could feel it now in the way the hands held him, in the way no one in the room seemed surprised. This hadn't been a confrontation. It had been over long before he walked in. The struggle ended as quickly as it had started. Morgan stopped fighting first, with his body, then with his eyes. The tension drained out of his shoulders, leaving him kneeling on the floor between the two men holding him, his breathing loud in the silence that followed. Without the shouting, without the bat in his hand, he looked smaller than he had a minute ago, like the anger had been the only thing keeping him standing. One of the men behind him tightened his grip slightly, not enough to hurt, just enough to make it clear nothing was about to change. Kang Eryun watched for a moment, then gave the smallest nod. "Take him downstairs," he said calmly. "Wait by the car." The men moved immediately. No hesitation, no wasted motion. They pulled Morgan to his feet, turning him toward the door he had broken open himself. His boots scraped against the floor as he stumbled once, then caught his balance, his head lowered, his jaw tight but silent. He glanced back only once, not at Kang, at Eve. The look didn't hold the same anger it had before. It didn't hold control either, just a quick, searching flick of his eyes, like he wanted to say something and couldn't find the words anymore. Then he was gone. The hallway swallowed the sound of their footsteps, and the apartment fell into a stillness so complete it felt unreal. The broken door hung crooked on its hinge, the cold night air drifting in, carrying the faint echo of the building's distant noise. But inside the room, nothing moved. Eve stayed where she was, her back still against the wall, her arms wrapped loosely around herself now, like she wasn't sure what to do with them. Her heart was still racing, but the fear that had filled her a few minutes ago had shifted into something else, something heavier and harder to name. Kang bent down, picking up the fallen bat with one hand, turning it once before setting it carefully on the table like it was nothing more than a misplaced object. Then he looked at her. "You can breathe," he said quietly. She let out a shaky breath she didn't realize she had been holding. What was that?" she asked, her voice thin, almost fragile. "Why were you here? Why was he talking about hiding something?" Kang didn't answer right away. He walked past the chair, his eyes moving slowly around the apartment, over the shelf near the window, the stack of books by the couch, the small table where her cup of tea still sat untouched. When he spoke, his tone was the same calm it had been all night. Morgan borrowed money from people he shouldn't have. Then he decided not to return something that didn't belong to him. When men like that run, they look for places they think are safe. His gaze settled on the bookshelf. He thought this was one of them. Eve followed his eyes, her stomach tightening again. "I don't understand," she whispered. Kang stepped closer to the shelf, reaching out without hesitation, his fingers sliding between the books until he pulled one free from the middle of the row. He turned it once in his hand, then opened the cover, shaking it gently. Something small slipped out and landed softly on the table. A thin black drive, no bigger than a thumb. Eve stared at it, her mind struggling to catch up with what her eyes were seeing. "He left it here weeks ago," Kang said. "He needed somewhere no one would search, somewhere he thought he could come back to when the noise died down." He closed the book and set it back in place. "You weren't part of it," he added, glancing at her again. "You were just the place he never stopped thinking he owned." The words settled into the room slowly. Eve looked at the broken door, the scattered wood on the floor, the empty space where Morgan had been standing, and felt something inside her loosen for the first time since the first knock hit the lock. Not relief, not yet, but the first hint that the night was finally moving in a different direction. The apartment was quiet again, but it wasn't the same quiet as before. For a long time after Kang left, Eve didn't move from where she stood. The broken door hung crooked in the frame, the night air still slipping through the gap, cool against her skin, carrying the faint sounds of the street below. Somewhere in the building, a television played low, a muffled voice behind a wall, ordinary noise that should have felt comforting. Instead, it just made the room feel larger than it had before, like something had been pulled out of it and the space hadn't settled yet. She wrapped her arms around herself and slowly pushed away from the wall. Her legs felt unsteady, the kind of weakness that comes after adrenaline leaves all at once. She took a careful step, then another, her bare feet brushing against the splinters near the doorway. She stopped there, looking down at the broken wood, at the jagged edge where the lock had torn loose. For months, she had imagined this moment in 100 different ways. Him showing up again, him shouting, him standing in the doorway like he used to, like the apartment was still his and she was just living in it for now. In every version she pictured, the fear always came first, the tight feeling in her chest, the way her hands would shake, the way her mind would start searching for the fastest way to make him calm down. Tonight had started the same way. Her body had remembered before her thoughts did. The sound at the door, the heavy steps in the hallway, the way her shoulders tightened without her telling them to. For a few seconds, it had felt like nothing had changed at all. But now the door was broken, the room was empty, and Morgan wasn't here. She let out a slow breath and stepped fully into the living room. The chair near the window was still turned slightly toward the center of the room, exactly where Kang had been sitting. The glass he'd used was gone, the table cleared, the only sign he'd ever been there, the faint mark where the chair legs had pressed into the rug. It should have felt strange. Instead, it felt finished. Eve walked to the window and pulled the curtain back a little farther. The sky outside was lighter now, the deep blue of night fading into gray, the first thin line of morning stretching across the tops of the buildings. A few cars moved on the street below, their headlights cutting through the last of the darkness. She watched them for a long moment, her breathing finally slowing. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. That surprised her. She looked down at them, turning them over like they belonged to someone else, waiting for the tremor she expected to see. It didn't come. The tight knot that had lived in her chest for so long felt different now, not gone, but loosened, like something had finally let go of it from the inside. Morgan had stood in this room only minutes ago, louder than ever, angrier than ever, convinced he could still make the world bend the way it used to, and he hadn't. He hadn't scared the night into stopping. He hadn't made her apologize. He hadn't made her feel small. Eve rested her hand against the window frame, the cool wood steady under her palm, and watched the first strip of sunlight slide across the floor behind her. For the first time since she left him, the apartment didn't feel like a place she was hiding. It felt like a place that was hers. She stood there until the light filled the room completely, letting the quiet settle the way it was supposed to, without waiting for the next noise, without listening for footsteps in the hall. And when she finally turned away from the window, she realized something she hadn't been able to believe before tonight. Morgan didn't have anything left here. Not the door, not the room, not her.